Have you ever noticed how exhausting life becomes when you try to control everything? You plan every detail, you worry about every outcome, and you hold on so tightly. Yet somehow, things never seem to flow the way you want them to. Instead of feeling in control, you feel trapped like a bird locked in its own cage of expectations. It's a strange paradox of life. The more you care in a desperate, clinging way, the heavier your heart feels, and the less peace you have. But here's the surprising truth. When you finally stop caring in that obsessive way, something magical happens. Life begins to flow, naturally, effortlessly, like a river that always knows its way to the ocean. This idea might sound almost dangerous at first. Stop caring. Doesn't that mean giving up, being lazy, or becoming cold and detached? That's the fear most of us have. But in the wisdom of the Buddha, not caring doesn't mean closing your heart. It means opening it wide enough to let go of what you cannot control. It means releasing the weight of unnecessary worries so you can finally breathe. Imagine for a moment you are holding a handful of sand. The tighter you grip, the more it slips away. But if you simply relax your hand, the sand rests peacefully in your palm. That's what life is like. When you stop clinging, when you loosen the grip of control, life has a way of resting gently in your hands. This teaching is not about indifference. It's about freedom. A freedom that allows you to walk through life with lightness instead of tension, with trust instead of fear. A freedom that lets you see beauty even in imperfection, because you are no longer demanding that everything bend to your will. And so, the real question we will explore is this. What happens when you stop caring in the way the ego wants you to care? What unfolds when you let go? When you stop fighting against the natural current of existence? If you stay with me, we'll walk this path together. We'll uncover the hidden wisdom the Buddha taught about attachment, about letting go, and about why surrendering isn't weakness, it's strength. You'll discover how to live in a way where peace isn't something you chase, but something that naturally arises. Take a deep breath. Let yourself soften for just a moment, because this journey begins right here, with one single choice: to let go of the burden of control and to see where life flows when you no longer hold it back. We live in a world that constantly tells us, care more, work harder, try to control everything. From a young age, we're taught that if we care enough, if we push enough, then life will reward us. And so we begin to carry this heavy belief that our worth is tied to how much we can control. But here's the hidden trap. When you care too much in this way, life becomes an endless battlefield. Every word from others feels personal. Every mistake feels like a disaster. Every plan must go exactly as you imagined, or else you feel like a failure. And soon you're not living anymore. You're just surviving under the weight of your own expectations. Think about it. Have you ever found yourself lying awake at night, replaying a conversation over and over? Maybe someone criticized you, or maybe they didn't even notice your effort, and your mind just won't let go. That's what happens when we care too much. We hand over our peace of mind to circumstances beyond our control. The Buddha often spoke about this subtle form of suffering. He called it tanha, craving, thirst. The craving for things to be exactly as we want them to be. The craving for people to act the way we expect. The craving for life to unfold on our timeline. This craving, though invisible, ties us in knots. It is the very root of dissatisfaction. And the more we tighten our grip, the more fragile we become. A small disappointment can shatter our day. A minor criticism can feel like a deep wound. A single failure can make us question our entire worth. We think caring this much makes us stronger, but in reality it weakens us. It places our happiness in the hands of the outside world, an unstable, ever-changing world. Picture this. A man walking through a storm, desperately clutching his umbrella as the wind tears it apart. He fights harder and harder, but the more he resists, the more miserable he becomes. If he simply let go, he would still be in the storm, but suddenly free of the struggle. That's what happens when you release the trap of overcaring. The storm may still be there, but the suffering eases. The truth is, there is nothing wrong with caring. Compassion is beautiful. Love is essential. But when caring turns into attachment, when we cling, when we demand, when we insist, then caring becomes a prison, and that prison is built from our own mind. So the lesson here is not to stop caring, but to see clearly how overcaring steals our freedom, to recognize the difference between genuine love and suffocating attachment. Because once you see the trap, you can begin to step out of it. And when you do, something extraordinary happens. You start to understand what true detachment means. You realize that you can still love deeply, still live fully, without being crushed by the weight of expectations. That insight opens the door to the next step in this journey, discovering what not caring really is, and why it's not coldness but wisdom. At this point, you might be wondering, if caring too much is a trap, then does that mean I should stop caring at all? Should I shut my heart and walk away from everything? The answer is no. That's not the wisdom of the Buddha. What he taught is far more subtle, far more profound. Not caring doesn't mean turning your back on life. It doesn't mean becoming cold, detached, or indifferent. It means learning to release the grip of attachment, the kind of caring that binds you in chains. Think of a lotus flower. It grows in muddy water, yet it rises untouched by the dirt around it. The lotus still exists in the world, still feels the warmth of the sun and the touch of the rain, but it does not cling to the mud. That is the essence of not caring. You can still live fully, still love deeply, but you are no longer imprisoned by the mud of expectations. When we misunderstand not caring, we imagine it as apathy, a kind of numbness. But true detachment is not numbness, it is clarity. It is being able to love without owning, to give without demanding, to walk away without bitterness. It is choosing freedom over control. Imagine holding a butterfly in your hand. If you squeeze too tightly, you crush it. If you hold with gentleness, it rests. It may even fly and return to you. That's what not caring really looks like. You allow life to breathe. You allow relationships to breathe. You no longer suffocate the things you love with your own fear of losing them. The Buddha called this way of living the middle path, not clinging, not rejecting, but walking in balance. It is the space between obsession and neglect. In this space, the heart is open but not desperate, strong but not rigid, kind but not attached. And here's the beautiful part. When you stop caring in the way the ego demands, you begin to care in the way the soul was always meant to. You care with compassion, not control. You care with love, not possession. You care with presence, not fear. This shift changes everything. Suddenly, the little things that used to steal your peace no longer hold power. Harsh words from others pass through you like wind through trees. Delays, failures, disappointments, they no longer break you, because your happiness is no longer chained to them. So when we talk about not caring, we are not speaking about emptiness of feeling. We are speaking about fullness of freedom. A freedom where love can flourish without fear. A freedom where life can flow naturally because you no longer stand in its way. And once you begin to taste that freedom, you realize something profound. Letting go is not losing. It is gaining back the peace you never should have lost. From here, the journey deepens. Because once you understand what not caring truly means, you can begin to see its incredible power. A power that transforms suffering into peace and struggle into flow. There comes a moment in life when you realize holding on is far heavier than letting go. We cling because we believe control will give us safety. We hold tight because we're afraid that if we release, everything will fall apart. But the truth is, it's the clinging that makes us suffer, not the letting go. Think of a river. If you stand in it and try to fight against the current, every step is a struggle. Your muscles ache, your breath shortens, and frustration builds. But the moment you stop resisting, the river carries you effortlessly forward. That's the hidden power of letting go. It transforms struggle into flow. The Buddha once compared attachment to carrying a burning torch against the wind. The tighter you cling to it, the more you get burned. Only by releasing it can you be free. And yet, we spend so much of our lives carrying torches, our fears, our desires, our need to control, without realizing the fire is consuming us. When you let go, something remarkable happens. Space opens. Space for peace. Space for clarity. Space for joy. It's as if your clenched fist finally relaxes, and in that release you discover your hand was always meant to be open. Look at nature, it never clings. Trees let go of their leaves in autumn, not out of despair, but out of trust that spring will return. Clouds release their rain, not to lose themselves, but to nourish the earth below. Even your own breath is a cycle of letting go. You exhale to make room for life to continue. Imagine if you tried to hold your breath forever, you would suffocate. That is what clinging does to the soul. Letting go is not weakness. It is strength of the highest kind. It takes courage to release control, to trust the unfolding of life, to believe that even if things don't go according to your plan, they can still go according to a greater wisdom. And here's the beauty. When you let go, you don't lose. You gain. You gain peace of mind, lightness of heart, and freedom from the invisible chains of expectation. You begin to experience life as it is, not as your mind insists it should be. Picture this: someone insults you. If you cling, you replay it endlessly, fueling anger. But if you let go, it becomes just a sound that passed through the air, nothing more. Or when life doesn't give you what you wanted, if you cling, you drown in disappointment. But if you let go, you may discover something even better waiting, something you couldn't see before. Letting go is not the end of caring. It is the beginning of truly living. Because only in release can you flow with the rhythm of existence, instead of exhausting yourself by resisting it. And as you taste this power, you realize that freedom doesn't come from controlling life. It comes from trusting it. From here, a new kind of freedom arises, one that no one can take away. A freedom that blossoms deep within your own heart. The greatest illusion we live with is believing that freedom lies somewhere outside of us. We tell ourselves, if only I had more money, if only I had the right partner, if only the world around me changed, then I'd finally be free. But Buddhism reminds us, true freedom does not depend on outer conditions. It begins and it ends within the mind. Look closely at your own life. Have you ever met someone who had everything, wealth, status, admiration, yet still felt restless, anxious, never satisfied? And on the other hand, perhaps you've known someone with little, yet their presence radiated calm and joy. That is the difference between a life chained by the mind and a life liberated from within. The Buddha once said, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." This points to an inner truth. No matter how loud the world becomes, the voice that truly binds you or frees you is your own mind. Imagine carrying a heavy backpack every day, filled not with stones but with thoughts, regrets about the past, worries about the future, expectations of how things should be. This invisible weight presses down on you far more than the external burdens you face. Now imagine setting that backpack down even for a moment. That lightness you feel, that is freedom, and no one can give it to you except yourself. Freedom is not about running away from life's challenges. It's about meeting them with clarity. When anger arises, you see it for what it is and don't let it control you. When fear whispers, you acknowledge it, but you don't bow to it. When desire pulls at you, you recognize it, but you don't lose yourself in its grip. That kind of awareness is liberation in action. And here's the paradox. When you no longer chase freedom in the outer world, you discover it was inside you all along. It was never hidden. It was simply buried under layers of clinging, fear, and distraction. Think of a lotus flower. It grows out of the mud, yet its petals remain pure, untouched by the dirt below. Your inner freedom is the same. Life may surround you with chaos, but when you rest in awareness, you rise above it, unshaken, untangled, untouched. Ask yourself this: what is really keeping me trapped? Is it the circumstances outside me? Or is it the story I keep telling myself about those circumstances? The answer is often closer than we think. True freedom begins the moment you realize you don't need to control the world. You only need to understand your mind. And when the mind is free, even in the middle of difficulty, you remain unshaken like a mountain standing tall against the storm. And so, freedom is not a destination. It's a daily practice, a choice moment by moment to step out of the cage of thought and rest in the open sky of awareness. That sky has always been within you, limitless, vast, waiting for you to remember. There's a quiet beauty that reveals itself when we stop forcing, stop chasing, and simply allow life to move as it wishes. Imagine a river. No matter how many rocks are in its path, it doesn't struggle against them, it doesn't complain, it doesn't panic. It simply flows around them, finding new routes, carving new ways, and still reaching the ocean. This is the essence of life. When we stop gripping it so tightly, everything begins to flow naturally. For so long, many of us live in resistance. We try to control outcomes, people, and circumstances, believing that if we hold on tight enough, we can make life bend to our will. But that effort often leaves us drained, frustrated, and restless. True peace comes not from control, but from trust, from understanding that life already knows how to carry us forward if we let it. When you stop worrying about how things should be, you start noticing how things truly are. Small moments become meaningful. The way sunlight touches your window in the morning, the sound of laughter from a stranger, the simplicity of breathing without rushing anywhere. These moments were always here, but your grasping mind was too busy trying to shape the future or repair the past. In Zen teachings, there is a deep truth. When you step out of the way, life steps in. The energy of existence, call it the Tao, call it Dharma, or simply the natural rhythm of things, carries you more gracefully than your anxious mind ever could. Like leaves carried by the wind, there's no resistance, only movement, only being. Think about those times when you felt in the zone, whether painting, writing, cooking, or even walking quietly through a park. You weren't analyzing every step. You weren't forcing an outcome. You were just there, present, flowing. That state wasn't something you created, it was something you allowed. And the more you allow it, the more effortless life becomes. But don't mistake this for passivity. Flow doesn't mean doing nothing. It means acting with harmony, moving with alignment, responding without resistance. A musician plays with flow when they no longer think about every note, but simply let the music pour through them. In the same way, you live with flow when you trust the deeper current of life and stop interrupting it with fear and control. There is also a mysterious synchronicity that arises when you live this way. Opportunities seem to appear at the right moment. People show up in your life when you most need them. What once felt like coincidence starts to feel like a natural unfolding, because you're no longer fighting against the current. You're moving with it. And the more you trust this flow, the lighter you feel. You begin to realize that happiness was never hidden somewhere far away. It was always right here, waiting for you to let go of the struggle. Life flows. It always has. The question is, will you flow with it or keep resisting the current? There's a deep sigh of relief that comes when you finally stop fighting against reality and begin to accept it just as it is. Acceptance isn't weakness. It isn't resignation. It is a quiet strength that says, this moment is enough. I don't have to resist it and I don't have to run from it. When we learn to rest in the present, something shifts inside us. The weight of regret begins to lift, because regret only lives in the past. The grip of anxiety loosens, because anxiety only feeds on the future. Right here, right now, this moment is free of both. And when you can dwell here even for breath, you discover a peace that no circumstance can take away. So much of our suffering comes from wishing life were different than it is. We wish people would act differently. We wish events had unfolded in another way. We wish our bodies, our relationships, our careers were something else. But wishing doesn't change what already is. It only steals the joy of what is here now. Acceptance is not about liking everything. You don't have to like pain, you don't have to enjoy loss, you don't have to celebrate struggle. But you can accept that they are part of this moment, just as joy, laughter, and beauty are. And in that acceptance, something surprising happens. Suffering lessens because resistance always magnifies pain. Resting in the present is also an act of awakening. Notice how the mind constantly pulls you away, planning tomorrow, replaying yesterday, analyzing, judging, worrying. But the present moment asks for nothing but your presence. Feel your breath. Notice the ground beneath your feet. Hear the sounds around you. Right here, right now, life is not asking you to solve everything. It's only asking you to be here. This is where true stillness is found, not in escaping the world, but in fully entering this moment. Even washing dishes, drinking tea, or walking slowly can become meditation when done with full attention. These ordinary acts become extraordinary because you are no longer half-living, split between the present and some imagined elsewhere. When you rest in the now, life stops being a chase. You no longer postpone happiness for a future condition. You no longer carry the heavy bags of the past. You are simply alive, simply here, and that is enough. The Buddha once said, "Do not dwell in the past. Do not dream of the future. Concentrate the mind on the present moment." In that single teaching lies the key to freedom. So let yourself settle just for a breath into this moment. It doesn't need to be perfect. It doesn't need to be special. It just needs you, awake, open, accepting. And when you can live from that space, you begin to discover a life not measured in years, but in moments truly lived. The beauty of these teachings is not found only in temples or meditation halls. Their true power awakens when you carry them into the flow of ordinary life. Because the truth is, your real practice begins the moment you step out into the world, into conversations, into traffic, into daily routines that test your patience, kindness, and awareness. You don't need to wait for a perfect silence to practice. Washing the dishes can be meditation if you are truly present. Feel the warm water, notice the rhythm of your hands, breathe fully. Suddenly, what seemed like a chore becomes a chance to rest your mind. Walking down the street can be a moment of mindfulness, each step grounding you, each breath reminding you that you are alive. Everyday life is full of hidden invitations to return to yourself. When someone irritates you, that's an invitation to notice your reactivity. When you feel rushed, that's a chance to pause and breathe. When joy arises, that's a moment to savor without clinging. Each experience, pleasant or unpleasant, becomes your teacher if you allow it. Even conversations can be practice. Instead of listening just to reply, you can listen to truly hear. Instead of speaking to impress, you can speak to connect. Suddenly, relationships stop being battlegrounds and become opportunities for compassion. The most profound transformation often comes not from grand moments of enlightenment, but from small acts of awareness repeated over and over. The way you sit, the way you eat, the way you look at another human being, these simple gestures shape your inner world. This is why Zen emphasizes chopping wood, carrying water. It's a reminder that enlightenment is not somewhere far away. It's here, in the very life you are living. If you can bring mindfulness to the smallest actions, the largest challenges will naturally begin to soften. Practice is not about escaping reality. It is about entering it fully. Life itself is your meditation cushion. Every breath, every step, every interaction is a chance to live awake. And the more you practice in these ordinary moments, the more extraordinary life begins to feel. When you finally loosen your grip on everything you once tried to control, people, outcomes, expectations, you begin to notice something remarkable. Life feels lighter. The endless weight you carried for years starts to dissolve, and for the first time in a long time, you can breathe deeply without fear of what's next. The results of stopping to care too much don't come all at once. They arrive quietly, like the morning light slipping through your window. One day you notice that the things which used to make you anxious no longer shake you so deeply. That criticism you once replayed in your head, it passes by like a cloud. That plan that didn't work out, you shrug, smile, and trust that something else will unfold. The first gift is peace of mind. Your thoughts stop racing in circles, and a calmness takes root inside. Life may still bring challenges, but they no longer own you. You face them with steadiness instead of panic, with clarity instead of confusion. The second gift is freedom. You realize you don't need to impress everyone, fix everything, or control what's beyond your reach. You are free to live, to breathe, to simply be. And in that freedom, your authentic self rises to the surface, unmasked, unforced, real. The third gift is deeper connections. When you stop caring in the desperate, grasping way, you actually begin to care more purely. Love becomes lighter, not heavy with need. You can give without expecting. listen without judgment, and allow others to be who they are without trying to mold them. Relationships blossom in that space of freedom. And finally, the greatest gift of all, life begins to flow. You stop pushing against the current, and suddenly, doors open where you once only saw walls. Opportunities come without forcing, joy arises without chasing, and contentment no longer depends on circumstances. This doesn't mean life becomes perfect. Storms still come, losses still happen, challenges still test you, but you now meet them differently. You no longer drown in the waves. You float, you adapt, you flow, and that changes everything. The moment you stop caring too much is the moment you begin living fully. What once felt like a burden now feels like freedom. What once felt like endless striving now feels like ease. And what once felt like survival now feels like life itself. As we come to the end of this journey, take a moment to look back at the path we've walked together. We began with a question: what happens when you stop caring too much? Along the way, we uncovered the traps of over-attachment, the power of letting go, the freedom of living in the present, and the beauty of allowing life to flow naturally. And now, standing here, the lesson is clear. True peace is not found in controlling the world, but in releasing our desperate need to do so. When you stop caring in the exhausting, anxious way, you don't become cold, you become free. Free to love more deeply, free to live more authentically, free to notice the quiet miracles of everyday life. The Buddha once said, "Peace comes from within, do not seek it without." And that is the heart of it all. Everything you've been searching for, happiness, clarity, love, meaning, has been here all along, waiting in the silence of your own being. It only needed you to stop gripping, stop chasing, and finally open your hands. So as you move forward from here, remember, let life be life, trust its rhythm, embrace its uncertainty, rest in its present moment. You don't need to have it all figured out. You only need to be awake enough to live it. Because when you stop caring too much, life begins to care for you. If these words touched your heart, let them stay with you. And if you feel this message belongs to others as well, share it with someone you love. For more timeless Buddhist wisdom to guide your journey, I invite you to subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. May your path be filled with stillness, clarity, and compassion.